got a February student? February. You started in February. Hands up, September. Very good. So good luck, September's this afternoon, and well done for coming, because I know you've got another exam this afternoon. Not many February students around though, that's a bit disappointing. Okay, we're filming this, so you can look at it again to remind yourselves. It's going to be put up on WebLearn, so that all the students who don't make it today can at least have an idea of what we're reviewing today. So what we're going to do is, for the first 10 or 15 minutes, we're going to get you to do a little bit of work, a little bit of revising, a little bit of remembering and reviewing what has happened. So we've seen 12 lectures. Alright, so I want you to get some paper in front of you. You're going to be making some notes today. It's not a passive lecture. If you haven't got paper, beg and borrow from your neighbour. Paper, everyone? Okay, so we're going to have a review of the whole module, and first of all, Jim's going to set up the first activity, and then we'll have some discussion back from you. It's going to be quite interactive, this, so you can ask questions at any point, okay? Jim, do you want to take over from here?
Yeah, so what we're going to do, we're just going to try to, with the session, to sort of set you up for the exam so you really know what to expect. And like Claire said, so we can answer any questions that you've got about the different questions. But first of all, just to get you to think about what those lectures and seminars were about, so the ones that you went to at least, can you brainstorm in 2s or 3s or small groups or whoever you like the look of, talk to them and just see what you can remember from each lecture and seminar. Okay? We're not asking you to remember all the facts and everything that was on all the slides you saw. Try to remember the topic, so generally what was it about, what was the subject area. Try to remember some of the activities maybe that we did in the seminars, okay? And also just try to remember anything that maybe was interesting or that stood out or that you remember about that lecture or about that seminar, okay? So for example, can anyone, thinking way back to the first lecture that we saw, can anyone remember what it was? What was the first lecture?
Architecture in London.
Drama.
That's week 3.
It was Chris.
It was this guy. Yeah, what was he doing? Can you remember? Digital something? Digital media? Yeah? Do you remember what he did? We watched a film? Exactly, yeah. Why?
Good question.
What was he talking about? Can anyone remember?
To
Embarrass the kids, yeah, okay. So, yeah, talking about the sort of the route between where he lives and here, and talking a little bit about the sort of history of London or the actual...
I think I was thinking, as I moved from one place to another, I thought I was able to draw on places and link them to the kinds of topics we'd be covering in the module. So it was a bit like the journey was a way of remembering the topics.
Yeah.
Actually, I mean, that is a memory technique that lots of people use. I don't know if people have ever come across it. You remember a journey and you put things you want to remember at places on that journey. But I think I was also highlighting the changes that have taken place with the advent of digital technology,
Yeah.
and the sense that, you know, maybe in the past, if you went to the cinema and watched a film, everybody would be watching in an audience a bit like you're in now, in a big auditorium, watching a film on the cinema screen. And a big change that's happened in the last 10 years is that you could say ordinary people are contributing media themselves.
Okay, so So that first lecture was really just an introduction to get you thinking about some of the themes and about London, the context in which we're all working and living. So the second lecture, I want you to think with each other, talk to each other, try to think what was it about, what did you learn from it, what was interesting about it, what kind of activities we did. And go through each week, trying to remember as much as you can in pairs or in groups. We'll give you about 10 or 15 minutes and then we'll get feedback from you so we can all together see what was in it, okay? So work with somebody next to you, close to you, 10 or 15 minutes. Oh yeah.
Well, we haven't said look at the get out there. Okay, if you've arrived late, everybody, people at the back who've arrived late, you're going through all the lectures in pairs. You're making a list of all the lectures and seminars that you have been to, trying to remember everything that you've attended. Pen and paper. Maybe that's it. Yep. Everyone's working in pairs.
Oh, okay.
Go sit next to someone. Well, it's that way and that way at the same time. Right. Okay, so you've had about 20 minutes to think and make some notes and try and remember with your colleagues the lectures and seminars, themes and interesting facts or events that happened in lectures and seminars. Okay? We're going to go through them one by one. Everything is on WebLearn. Okay, so you need to use WebLearn. So if you've got your mobile phone now and you've downloaded the Blackboard app, you can look at your phones in the lecture. No Wi-Fi. Have you signed in? Has anybody signed in to MetNet? All right.
Can I just say, Claire, if you've got, you know, the Blackboard mobile app, sometimes if you log out and then log back in, I know it sounds silly, but you will get in. Because if you've left it for a while and you go straight in, you'll get this spinning kind of wheel, yeah? If you log out, which is in settings at the bottom, log out, log back in, and it should connect properly, yeah? Can you see settings at the bottom, log out, log back in?
Your password and your
It's the
normal
same.
login. It's like your library password. Same. Your email password, everything. eVision. Okay, so those who've got the mobile app, the Blackboard app, we've got it here on the screen as well. Okay. So the second week, the first week was Chris's lecture talking about the multidisciplinarity of social science and humanities and linking digital identity to the theme of London as well. And that was an introduction to a variety of lectures that you were going to see throughout the next 11 weeks. So the first, come on girls, we've started now. Can you come down this side and up there, because it's too busy this side. Go up there, please. So, the first lecture that we saw was from Trevor Norris, who was the course leader for English Literature and Creative Writing. And he gave a really nice presentation on, who can tell me? Social exclusion in the 18 in the Victorian times, yeah? Was it Victorian or earlier?
19th century.
19th century, yeah.
He looked at a number of different periods
Yeah, he did.
within the Victorian era and highlighted how things changed and really how I think social interventions were made around areas like housing and education, and how different writers understood and interpreted what was taking place. But there was a particular angle on poverty and on looking at the development of the area around Regent Street. Do you remember that? And one of his kind of theses was that the development of all of the Nash architecture around Regent Street represented an attempt by the wealthy to kind of hide away the poor parts of London to the east of Regent Street, to the east of Soho. And he looked particularly at St Giles, the area of St Giles, which is where New Oxford Street is today.
I think he also looked at the way poverty is represented in the media. So if you remember the different writers portraying it for different reasons. And do you remember the writer he spoke about who became very famous later on, obviously, Charles Dickens. And when he first started writing, he was writing for a newspaper. And he had to write kind of sensational stories about what he saw as he walked from east to west and from west to east in London. Okay? And Trevor talked a little bit about how poverty and deprivation is represented in the media and comparing it to sort of today and the way that's represented.
maybe that idea that you need to ask questions about what you're reading and think about what's behind what somebody's saying. So if somebody's talking about, as Trevor was suggesting, Charles Dickens was talking not always in a very positive light about the poor, maybe to try to understand what might be driving, what might be motivating that writing. And then there was somebody called, and I've forgotten her surname, Flora. Anybody remember?
Yeah.
Flora Tristram, well done,
yeah.
who wrote in a more sympathetic light because really she was writing for herself or writing for a different audience and not being paid as a journalist.
And she was aware of the social exclusion element, had she suffered it herself. So she was writing a sympathetic point of view. One of the most interesting points that I took from that lecture was how Trevor described that kind of writing nowadays is something we don't see, and that kind of writing nowadays is done by social science professionals, like social workers and probation officers and all kinds of jobs that graduates from social sciences might be doing. But that's very much within the public sector. It's not stuff that's published out there in a sensationalist way. We get sensationalist news stories, but not the kind of reports that we're reading. The modern day equivalence is stuff that we don't really read. We don't get to read the gory details of Baby P's case. Yeah, we just heard the sensationalist story in the newspaper, but we don't know all the details of that family and that case that Trevor mentioned as an example in the lecture. Does anyone else?
So in a sense, the role of today's social workers was one that didn't exist in the period that Charles Dickens was writing, and or Flora Tristram was writing, and you could argue that they were fulfilling that role.
Yeah.
Somebody was going to make a
Can
contribution.
you also speak about that architect that created, was it Park Road? That road?
Regent Park.
Street.
Yeah.
Regent Street, yeah. And how it was built to separate the poor and the rich.
Yeah.
So
It
that's
was Nash.
The
Yeah.
architect was Nash.
Anybody else got any other comments that they found interesting from that lecture that you discussed with your colleagues next to you? Things you didn't understand, perhaps, that we can clarify now? If not, we'll move on to the next week then, which was the film studies lecture, which was given by Karen and Mike. Karen McNally, who's course leader of film and TV studies, and Mike Chopra Grant, who is what is his role?
He's a reader in media, culture and communications.
So they had two shorter lectures that they both spoke about. So Karen spoke about, anyone remember? Hitchcock, yes. And she spoke specifically about a film called The Man Who Knew Too Much. And she showed us stills of the film and I think a little trailer. And she linked that to the theme of London. And Mike, slightly differently, showed us some of the pictures he's taken of social housing that's been built in the 50s, wasn't it? And how they're considered quite artistic and I can't remember any more about that one.
He talked about the kind of utopian vision
That's it.
that the people who built that social housing had. It was linked to the aesthetic treatment of the way the houses were built. They sort of followed a principle of modern design, lots of use of concrete, and the reduction in the use of decoration, for example. So very simple, utilitarian modern designs. And I think he talked a bit about how there's a kind of irony there, really, that the people who live in those dwellings don't necessarily, or haven't actually necessarily found them particularly utopian places to live. They've often gone into disrepair in the period following the time that they were built. And one of the things that's happening today is that they're being sold off refurbished and sold for very high prices because, you know, the people who are buying properties might actually see some value in the kind of history of that architecture. But there's a real irony there, I think. Would you agree?
Okay. Just going through.
Does anybody, can I just ask, does anybody remember anything about Claire's talk? Karen's talk. I remember her showing a picture of the people arriving in The Man Who Knew Too Much, a picture of people arriving from an aeroplane at Heathrow Airport. Do you remember that? From Morocco. And do you remember what she showed and highlighted in that photo? Yeah. That there was a London bus. Oh, there it is. Brilliant. Yeah. So this kind of representation, fictional representation of London for the purposes of cinema. What was she highlighting there in terms of themes that were covered in that film, do you think?
Safety.
Sorry?
Safety. That's more safe. It's safer here.
Than in Morocco. Okay. Anything else? There are some things.
Yeah.
Do you remember what we looked at in the seminars for this week, for week 3? Do you remember what we did in the seminars? It was related to film. Yeah? Anybody? Acting, it's the same week, yeah. We looked at some very short films. Remember? 3 different short films. Can anyone remember who did any of those films?
Yeah.
No, it wasn't Hitchcock. No. It was more recent, wasn't it?
Yeah. Look like the Muslim woman that was sitting in the
Yeah, so there's one about the 7-7. Yeah. There was one also by a guy called, he's a poet. George the Poet. Yeah, you remember that one? Okay. And so those are all different ways of representing London, really perhaps slightly different ways than the mainstream of representing London, representing the city and what it means to those people. Yeah? Okay. So you can go back and look at those in the seminar. If you look on WebLearn in the seminar section, the films are there. You remember that? Yeah.
I think there was a sense as well, wasn't there, that in the 1950s when the film that Karen was showing was made, she was arguing that there was a particular perspective on the relationship between a developing country and a Western country. That was, so she was interested in the way that relationship was represented. And maybe the films that we showed, you know, represented issues like migration or different cultures coming into juxtaposition in a different way.
So those 3, they're very short films, but you can look at those again. Here are the questions. They will prompt a lot of thought about this. So protagonists and characters, the relationship between them in the film and in London. And thinking about the film's message. And again, we related this back to the 19th century writers and what similarities and differences there were between these modern videos made about London and those stories that Trevor talked about, those writers who were writing in the 19th century. There are quite a lot of similarities there. So linking those 2 weeks was one of the things we did as well. And the purpose of literature and film, there are a lot of similarities between literature and film. And nowadays, there is both. But film is being used a lot to do the same kind of things that literature did in the 19th century. Some of you then maybe, I don't know, some students were very interested in doing this, I don't know how many people did this, but thinking of making a short film of your city. So that idea of your identity in London was one of the things that we were trying to bring out from this week of lectures. Okay? We'll move on now to the...
What was in week 4? Anyone remember?
Reading week.
Reading week.
Oh, you
So
all
nothing.
remember that one.
Reading week.
Yeah.
Okay. Then in week 5, Oh, sorry, I'm not on lectures. Week 5 was theatre performance and practice. So anyone tell us, give us a quick overview of the lecture. Anybody remember the lecture? It was about the knife crime?
Some students that did recite plays, those are student parties.
That's good, yeah. So we had some students, some first year students from, yeah. So we had 2 theatre students, theatre practice students coming in on their first year, and they acted out some lines from plays, I think it was just one play on Stephen Lawrence.
I think there were 3 plays.
Yeah, there was 3. She did the last one a couple of times.
Oh,
And
Sort of in different styles.
Yeah.
Okay, so knife crime and yeah, she talked about 3 plays, and she linked obviously the police, the institutional racism and how the Metropolitan Police were, well, criticised, and there's been several reports written about them since then. And we looked at the colour of these 3 plays, and that was the second one. And then this one was random. And that was a solo performance where she played all the parts. Do you remember? And she showed us a small video of that one. And there was a trailer there for you to watch. And these were the questions that she wanted you to consider. Oh, what? Right, so everyone, onto your apps.
Oh, I've got mine on.
You got it.
let's. Do you remember what characterised the 3 different plays?
Yeah. There was one was a naturalistic drama,
So a naturalistic drama,
so it's a fly on the wall type.
Fly on the Wall.
One was a verbatim piece, so it could be one-sided. Only
So
shows one-
verbatim as in,
It's very biased.
but verbatim sounds like it was using the words. This is one of the things that Lucy highlighted. There was an idea of using the exact words that were used in the court hearing.
The
In one of the
editor will very much choose what words are spoken.
Right.
So you don't see 2 sides of the argument. Whereas the solo performance, yeah, it was just a solo.
There was a contrast in the use of language, would you say? In the one that was the solo performance, I think that the use of language was not formal language. Does that sound right? You remember that?
I think the solo one was done more, so to take on the character, so it was very much word for word as the mother spoke, in the same tone that the mother spoke.
Yep, so it was like everyday
It was-
speech,
Yeah.
rather than the kind of speech that you might use in a courtroom. And what did we do in the seminar after the talk that Lucy gave?
We did a role play.
And what did we do in the role play?
Restorative justice.
Absolutely. So that's restorative justice. And go on.
Did you enjoy that role play?
Yeah.
I know lots of people were quite worried about it, and I know a lot of people, when we told you in the lecture that you were going to do a role play afterwards, a lot of people disappeared.
Yeah, because we didn't know what it was about, we didn't know what we're going to say.
But actually, role play is one of the things that you will do on lots of your courses, especially if you're developing professional skills in some of the social worker jobs, health and social care, community development and leadership. So role play is a very useful skill to practice.
Especially at home.
But Chris, you didn't give us much time. Remember, you gave us like 10 minutes just to brainstorm and get in our groups and then us around the spot. It was good. It was a good experience, but we were always on our toes.
Okay.
Okay, so we're going to move on because we want to get through all the lectures. Just a quick overview. After the theatre performance we had, Can anyone remember this lecture? It was Patrick. What did Patrick show us, talk to us about? Deptford. Yeah. And he showed us a film about how the council developed an area in Deptford. And he talked about whether it was myth or reality. So he showed the two sides of the argument, the people who lived there and the council workers. And it was quite hard to work out whether the council had done the right thing knocking down that area. The people who lived there seemed to think it was a terrible thing that the council had done. But it was like there's two opposing views. The local people who live there and the council having to improve quality of housing for the people who live in that borough. In the seminar, can you remember what we went on to do? You're nearly there.
Yeah,
To improve a sustainable.
make it an area economically.
Sustainable.
Yeah.
Yeah, we asked you to talk about 5 key points how to make and develop a sustainable community. Yeah, and then we also asked you to do that in your personal learning journals. So to write down what were the 5 steps, or if you wanted to choose your own, you could also add in your own. Yeah, so that was how to make a more sustainable community. So trying to find solutions to some of the problems that were raised by Patrick about communities generally. Can you remember what any of those issues or problems were? What were some of the problems facing Deptford? Housing shortage.
Quality of housing.
And quality of housing. Environmental health officers. What did they do?
They just made sweeping statements about stuff they didn't know much about. They weren't architects. They just looked at buildings and went, it looks a bit crap, so it has to be knocked down. And the people are definitely quite happy to have it.
Can you repeat that back to so people at the back can hear?
So that was the view of the community seemed to be quite happy with the housing, even though the environmental health officers from the council had decided that the housing wasn't of good enough quality and needed to come down. However, Patrick then did talk to us about the idea of rose-tinted spectacles, didn't he? He's saying how memory can sometimes trick us, that when you think back to things in your childhood, you only remember the really good things, and that he thought that some of these local people were perhaps looking back at how life used to be like when they had those houses in a kind of nostalgic way. All right, so that was the idea of the myth and reality. Council thought they were doing something good for the local community, but the local community were viewing things in a slightly different way. But, you know, again, those roles that you did in the seminar are the kind of jobs that you might be doing in the future, working in the public sector. So we tried to put you in that position to see what it felt like to be making those decisions, okay, and discussing those kind of issues that come up related to housing in particular, which was Patrick's main theme. The next
Can I just highlight one other thought from there? Do you remember something that he said about how we should look at the video with some scepticism? I think he drew our attention to the fact that the story that was told in the video, although it had lots of interesting things in it,
It was one-sided.
Yeah.
and I think he was a bit like the accounts that Trevor gave. I think he was highlighting that we always need to look with some critical perspective or scepticism at any artifact that we're examining, because something that goes out on TV as entertainment, which is kind of what you could see that as, there may be other reasons behind the ideas that are being represented. And he did highlight one explanation for the changes that took place in Deptford that were not to do with the town planners.
Wasn't there a huge ethnic group they completely ignored that made up something like 40% of the community? But the only people he interviewed were white people or Afro-Caribbeans.
Okay.
Vietnamese community.
The Vietnamese community.
Well, the Vietnamese community were represented in a
very short
very
piece.
small way.
Yeah.
But I think he maybe said,
Finger
For
got
the crab, yeah?
by the
sorry?
her finger got bitten by the crab.
That's right. But he also gave a kind of historical explanation that was not to do with just the town planners intervening and making a mistake and knocking places down? What did he say might also account for changes in an area's sustainability? And he talked about Deptford in particular and the kind of work that people did in Deptford historically. Absolutely, yeah. So he just highlighted that, you know, something that was completely not accounted for in the discussion was the fact that an entire industry completely disappeared in the course of the period that was under consideration. I saw a brilliant photograph of, it was Churchill's funeral, and it showed his coffin being taken down the Thames. I think this was just a year ago, that was an anniversary of his death. If you look at the Thames in those days, all of the Thames that you know today, right up to where Tower Bridge is, there were cranes lining the Thames because boats unloaded goods there, and that industry, which neighboured Deptford, just disappeared. So always look under the story.
Yeah, critical thinking. So again, linking your critical thinking module to this module too. And Patrick was very keen to make that point that critical thinking is very important in all your reading, everything you read, everything you watch. You have to think else is going on behind that. Yeah? Now, the next week, I'm afraid I wasn't here, so you might have to come and talk about this one. Jo Skinner came and talked to us about health and considered the challenges in addressing the health and needs of Londoners. And she looked at how London was, where the size of the population, the wealth, deprivation, public health issues then, and now we've still got those same issues. Okay?
Do you remember her talking about health inequalities, and she showed a tube map? Do you remember a map of a tube and one line? Which line did she show? Which tube line? Do you remember? No. Which is the grey one? So the Jubilee line. And what did she say about the Jubilee line as you go from west to east? Lifespan or life expectancy. What happens to it? Yeah, I think it's every 2 stops is 1 year less life expectancy as you go east on the Jubilee line. That's how she said it. So she was trying to highlight the fact that depending on where you are in London, the health outcomes and the health equalities or inequalities are quite stark. So, you know, she was talking a bit about Tower Hamlets and further east and how the life expectancy, particularly among certain groups, was very much lower than, for example, in many areas of West London, wasn't she? Do you remember that?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. Anything else you can remember from that lecture?
What are the big
The links between things like income and health, yeah. So actually how health is linked to so many different factors. Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
People live long.
Yeah.
Could you say that back? I couldn't hear.
That was just about, yeah, life expectancy and how the richer you are, the longer you live, essentially.
And the area you live in as well, isn't it?
Yeah, and the area you live in.
We looked at who's responsible for health. Whether it's individuals or communities, or the NHS or government.
That's right. So she looked at the responsibility for health, so how it had developed and the beginnings of the NHS and the sort of public bodies and who was responsible and how much is individual responsibility versus responsibility of, for example, the government.
And she looked at
Say
the
again?
Prostitution or how young people sleep around and how they went to the clinics or with the NHS. I can't remember if it was this one or the 19th century one.
I think that might have been the literature one.
Yeah, that's the one, yeah. So the difference between the personal health services and the public health. And looking at the different government departments that are involved in health, even though they look quite separate, there is a link there, which is replicated in the linking of all the subjects in the faculty. Education studies, there's often a crossover with public health issues, etc.
Could I ask a question about what are the big issues facing government in relation to health?
Costs.
The cost, absolutely. So we know that the kind of public policy context is that, well, we've got a party who've been elected to government in the last week that have a priority to do what? Cut costs, cut something else. Well, that's the same as costs in a way. Aren't they interested in cutting taxes? Sorry? You don't think, well, the Conservative government, David Cameron, in the last weeks of the election, made a pledge that he would be controlled by statute. In other words, he would make a law that would stop himself from putting taxes up. So at a time when costs are going up all the time in the NHS, the government are committed to not raising taxes. And in fact, really, I think the Conservatives stand for the idea of, in general, lower taxation. So we've got raising health costs and potentially reducing taxation. So there's a massive gap in funding. And all the time, every year, people's expectations of health provision go up and up and up. So what are the solutions? How can you address that?
Start taxing the rich.
There's that, but there's another, people would say, in relation to public health, there's another possible solution.
Go private.
Okay, but there's another possible solution around what you can do to reduce the cost of healthcare. What is it? I think that's a good point.
Do some exercise.
Do some exercise. Take personal responsibility. But also make interventions that reduce ill health. If you can do more work on the side of prevention, potentially the really costly side of health, which is to do with treating illness, that can be reduced. The cost of that can be reduced. So there's a massive agenda, whatever party's in power, to try to not waste money on treating ill health. And there are particular policy areas around different aspects of health.
Okay, health's a big area that crosses over lots of the areas that you will study in, not necessarily just health and social care. Education was the next week. David looked at the historical growth of schooling. He gave a historical perspective, talking about the development of the schools in London, and talked in particular about the British schools and Joseph Lancaster's system and what education was like before the 1870 Education Act. And Chris, can you give a quick overview?
Yeah, he talked a lot about the buildings, which I thought was interesting, because we're not doing an architecture course, and yet many people talked about building, didn't they? Trevor talked about it, Patrick talked about it, Mike Chopragant talked about it, and then David talked about it. You'd almost think we were on an architecture course. And do you remember the style of architecture that David highlighted that had been used in all of the school buildings that were built in the period following the Act?
Well, they're like factories.
Oh, well, he did. There was that idea. The idea of, he called them triple deckers. The idea that you go in and go around the first floor in kind of, I'm trying to think what the stage would be. Prior to Key Stage 1, Key Stage 1 equivalent would have been the second floor, and Key Stage 2 would have been the third floor. But
is the one in Putnam.
Yeah. They're still
well,
around, yeah.
he also talked about, I can't remember who it was, there was a writer that he mentioned who described London as being a place that you approached on the train, and from a distance you saw the kind of two-storey slums, as they described them, and then punctuating these slums were these extraordinary palaces of education. So the city was like, this place that had palaces springing up all over the place, celebrating education. But what was the name of the style of architecture? Queen Anne revival. So if you, I haven't stopped looking at schools since David's lecture. They are just extraordinary. The amount of money they spent on them to embellish them and make them beautiful, I think really did signal something about what education meant to that Victorian society and culture. And then we did something related to the industrial approach to education in the seminar. Do you remember we looked at one particular video? Do you remember that? It was a kind of cartoon, hand-drawn video. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
And this was from an educationalist, a contemporary theoretician who argues that our approach to education was designed for the Victorian era and is no longer appropriate for the kind of work that people have to do today. That, you know, in the Victorian era, the argument was, whether you accept it or not, that an industrial approach to education might have been appropriate because we had an industrial society where people went to work in factories. So if schools resemble factories, that might have been appropriate because people went to work in factories. Today, the argument is that, you know, people's working lives are very different. They don't do the same job necessarily. They don't have one job for life. They have to be able to learn all the way through their life. They need to be able to challenge knowledge that's being imparted to them through education. So I think there was an argument about the fact that our schools still follow the industrial model, but our working culture is very different.
Okay, we're going to just very quickly remind you of the others, but I want you to go through this on your own web learning. So we're running out of time. We want to give you a bit more information about the exam. So in week 9 we looked at criminology, and Dan talked about the several courses in the area. It's a very big department in the university. He talked about all the different courses that there are and the joints that you can do. So there's a lot of criminology and law, criminology and policing, criminology and psychology, criminology and sociology. So a lot of students end up doing criminology and something from the extended degree.
He picked up on very similar themes as well, didn't he? He talked about, in quite controversial ways, about the relationships between different areas of London and different levels of crime.
So yeah, similar to the health, he looked in particular at Tottenham, didn't he? But again, talked about the different boroughs of London. The following week after that was sociology, social policy, given by Stuart. He talked about homelessness. And in our seminar, I cannot remember. Can anyone remember what we did in the seminar?
I think we might have done some practice writing an exam.
Oh yeah, we did some writing practice, that's right, yeah. We looked at, and there's a lot of extra reading that Stuart suggested, which is all there in the seminar. I don't know how many of you have done any of it, but it might be good to have a look through some of those for the exam, to have ideas fresh in your head. There were some short texts that we looked at in the seminar which are there. The following week was international relations and politics, and that was Andrew Moran, who spoke to us about London as a global city. And we looked particularly at politics because the general election was coming up. And we looked at the voting, and we asked you to write a response to it. So in the last few weeks of this course, since the criminology week, all the activities we've been doing in the seminar are similar to the ones we want you to do in the exam. Okay? So, you've had a lot of practice in the last few weeks on reflective writing. Reflective writing you've also studied in your foundation studies module, so it is not new to you. And in the exam you are going to be asked to do reflective writing. So just quickly going to show you on, if you go to assessment here on the WebLearn, assessment details, I emailed this to you all. This is a revised assessment overview. So if you haven't read this yet, this is what is going to be in the exam next week. So as we were talking about here, you've experienced a series of lectures and seminars from across the faculty, and you're starting to clarify for yourselves which course you want to study. We've tried to show you multidisciplinary strands and skills across the subject areas, and in the seminar, you've been asked to think about the ways subjects overlap. Okay, and this is important for the exam. All right? You have been asked to write a reflective journal. Some of you have done it very well. And that's great for you because now when you go back and read that before the exam, you will have a lot of very good fresh ideas of how you reacted to things throughout the module. For those who haven't done that, it's not great, but you should be able to write something in the exam, but it won't be as good as if you reflected on it throughout the course. Question?
Are we allowed to bring notes in?
No. But that's why you can revise for it for beforehand, and if you've done that work throughout the module, it will be there, as long as you can revise through and read through your own journal, okay? The other thing we asked you to consider was yourself as a digital learner. So when you started this course, you might have thought that you had quite good IT skills, etc. And so we asked you to do a questionnaire. I don't know if anybody's done it. There is a questionnaire here that we really recommend that you do. So go to assessment details, and at the bottom, scroll down. What kind of digital learner are you? And this is from the University of Exeter. And it's just like a quick quiz that you do on Facebook or something. You answer the questions. I make use of digital technology that few other students are using, etc., etc. And you work your way through the survey. At the end, it throws up a score about what kind of digital learner you are. And it's good for you to do that so that you can see what your strengths and weaknesses are. You can then use that for your exam, okay, to talk about that. So what are the questions you're actually talking about? Jim's going to show.
Do you remember, in week 3, we actually asked you to do a reflective journal post, which was about how you use technology yourself as a student. So we asked you to think about strengths and weaknesses, and we asked you to think about perhaps potential tools or technologies that you use that have helped you to learn and to study more effectively. Now, I've been putting things on a blog inside the WebLearn module. If you want to have a look, hopefully you've seen some of this already, but if you see this link here, has anyone seen that?
Yeah.
A few, okay. So if you go in and then you click on the blog itself, you'll see some examples of different tools that we've been recommending and that we'd like you to try to use. The reason being, it will help you become a more effective student. And we know that as you go through your course, if you start using these kind of tools now, could be talking about Google Drive, about Diigo for saving websites, about RefMe for helping you with referencing. So things like this, learning them now will give you a big advantage as you go through your course. So we're trying to get you to actually experiment a little bit with these tools early on, and then to write about how it's helped you. Has anyone used RefMe, by the way? Yeah? Does it help? It can save a lot of time. It can save a lot of time if you use it well. So that's the kind of thing we're trying to encourage you to do. Okay? One thing to point out about this blog, if you look on the right, there's only one here, so it's the mobile app, for example. If you click on the dates at the side, you see all the other posts. Okay? So for example, in March, we looked at easy ways to keep track of websites that you use for research and things like this. We also looked at Google Drive, a very good video with one of our students talking about how she uses Google Drive. She's a 3rd year, and how it's helped her through her studies. Okay. If you haven't used any of these, you can still reflect on, for example, your WebLearn module, so how WebLearn's helped you, or your personal learning journal. If you've reflected every week, you can write about how that's been, what kind of experience that has been. Okay? So question 3, what we're saying basically, is reflecting on your strengths and weaknesses as a digital learner and writing about one tool that you've used, okay, which has helped you. And again, it's thinking about what it's meant to you, how it's, how you found it useful or what you found difficult about it, and how you think it will help you in your future, okay, your future as a student.
Okay, so that is question 3. All right? And question 3 is 20% of the exam, so it's 20 marks out of 100. Okay? Question 2, you've had loads of practice at this, especially if you've been coming to all the seminars. And we had an extra session last week for practice for people who wanted to come along after the open day. And this is a pure piece of reflective writing. And you get 6 topics to choose from. You just write about one. They're linked to the lectures, the topics and themes that came up in the lectures. So that's why we've just gone over the lecture topics and themes very quickly, but you should be able to write something on that one. And we ask you to use one of the models of reflection, so either the description, interpretation, outcome, or the Gibbs model, which you're also using in your foundation studies. Either one of those is fine, okay? And that's 40% of the exam.
Sorry, could you repeat that?
All of it.
Yeah, the Gibbs, not the Gibbs.
The Gibbs.
Yeah.
The Gibbs model is in
When did you look at that?
youth, well, it was also in youth work week. So if you look at, in the lectures, you should have the Gibbs model from your foundation studies. So this is there's youth work.
I think
This
it
is
has,
the Gibbs model.
it has 6, oh, there we go. So,
Yeah. That's in the youth work week. All right, we talk particularly about the
7, you could say 7 steps, but
It's very similar to the basic description, interpretation, outcome. So the description, the very first one, is obviously the description, and that's the short part. Then we've got 3 sections: feelings, evaluation, analysis. That's the interpretive part. Okay? Then the conclusions, general, specific, and action plans. That's the outcome. That's you looking forward and how you're going to take what you've learned from your reflection and how you're going to use it for whatever you do next. Okay, so you've had lots of practice at doing this in class. You've had practice at it in your foundation studies. The choices that you will have, you'll have 6 very broad choices. Everyone should be able to write about something. But we're looking for that structure. You won't get good marks if you don't use a clear structure. Okay?
could I ask something there?
Yeah.
So, should people make the headings evident? What do you think?
No.
I'd say
No. You use paragraphs. That's what paragraphs are for. Each paragraph does a different thing. Okay? You're only writing about 300 to 350 words. It's not a huge amount.
But
So
should
you do need to think.
so should you use the structure headings?
I don't really. If they want to use headings for your own, that's fine. But I should be able to read it and understand what structure's been used from what's in each paragraph.
Okay. And next question.
That's why I'm hoping for.
Would it be better to use the description, interpretation, outcome, and the Gibbs model?
No.
No, but given that you have to do 2
No,
pieces.
one or the other. Whichever they're more comfortable with. Choose the one you're most comfortable with. Okay? Right, let's move on. The main question we want to talk about today is question 1. Okay? So let me just show you that on the assessment details. Right. This is what we've changed in the exam. Alright? We've made this a little bit more open. So question 1 and question 2 are both 40%. You will write between 300 and 350 words for question 1 and for question 2, about 250 words for question 3. Okay, you're not writing a lot. By the end of the exam, you'll have written about 1,000 words. 750 to 1,000 words. That's the acceptable word limit for a level 3 course. Okay? It's not a lot if you have a look at what 300 words looks like on a page. Okay? You've got 2 hours to do it, so you do have to think a little bit before you start writing. Right, question 1, we're just going to show you something now to give you a little bit of an idea of what you'll be looking at. You're going to read a short case study of a person, and you're going to have to understand, think how different disciplines can help us understand causes and suggest solutions. So you're thinking about causes and possible solutions to a situation, or in this case, a case study. And the very important thing is, this is not a reflective piece of writing, so we don't want you to do description and interpretation. It's your opinions and your knowledge, okay? And what you think you would do, all right? And we will give credit, so good answers will be from people who are referring to ideas and things in lectures or the seminars, the activities that we've done. Alright, so if you can link it somehow to what you've taken part in and experienced on the module, you will get higher grades in that question. Alright? So we're going to show you quickly a similar question to the one in the exam. Do you want to see it?
Yes.
Sure? Yes, please. No, it's not going to be on WebLearn. I've got a few copies.
Can we go a little bit bigger?
I can't see that.
Can you see
We'll turn
that?
the
at
lights
the back?
down. We'll turn the lights down.
Can't see a question.
I can't see anything.
Can you see it at the back now?
No.
Did you
Move
say
forward
yes?
then. Move forward.
Can't see that. Glasses, maybe.
Okay, so just can you describe what it shows? Because we're going to have to do it in pieces, aren't we?
All right, so as Claire was saying, for question 1, you're going to have a short piece of reading, which is about just over a page. It's a case study, and it's easy to read. And that will have a kind of chart or a graphic with it containing some information. It won't be this exact one, but it'll be, we're giving you something similar so you get the picture, you get the idea, okay? And the question will involve reading that short case study, looking at the information on the chart, and then interpreting it and thinking about how the different disciplines that you've looked at can be related to this case study, okay? So it's up to you to think about all the things that we've learnt on this course. How does that relate to this particular case study? And to think about some of the causes and some of the solutions, okay? So what we did with, for example, the community with Patrick and in the seminar, thinking about potential solutions for sustainable communities. That's the kind of thing that we're asking you to do, those kind of ideas. How can you make a more sustainable community? Although it won't be about that particular subject, but the idea is it's solutions to a social issue, basically, okay? The social issue here, for example, is social exclusion. How does it happen? Okay, and you can see that this chart has, it talks about somebody called Matthew, age 19, okay, and it talks about his childhood from under the age of 11 through his teenage years up to young adult, and it talks about some of the issues that can lead to him at the age of 19 becoming sort of socially excluded, getting into problems, getting into difficulties. Okay, so what you need to do is to think about those disciplines. Could be health, could be social care, could be education, could be criminology, anything that we've looked at. How does it relate in this scenario? Okay, and to describe what you think are some of the causes and what you think are some of the solutions to that issue. Okay, so it's quite general. What we don't want you to do is to remember lots of facts from all the lectures. Okay, so we're not testing you on lots of factual knowledge, what can you remember exactly from each lecture, but it's the ideas that came up through the lectures and through the seminars that we want to see evidence of, that you've been thinking about some of those issues, and that you can relate more than just one discipline to a social issue. So you can see that actually there are lots of different things that can have an effect. Okay? So it'll be a case study.
Any questions on that? It's quite general. It's quite open, so you can all apply your different knowledge to it. We're just asking for you to show at least 2 disciplines that are related. Okay?
If your interest was in media,
Yeah?
how might you tackle something like this?
Well, not on this particular one.
I'm just thinking representation of young people might be an angle that you could think about.
Yeah, but also you don't have to apply your own subject to it, so it's just basically from any of the lectures. It's not limited to one particular subject.
Is that a question at the back? No?
Can you see here, so just to point out, you've got things like adverse family circumstances. So this is the sort of, social care element, social policy. Primary school, you could talk about education. Then you've got accommodation, so issues around housing and so on. Benefits. Okay, and again, politics could be sort of an overarching thing for all of this, so you could talk about politics as well. School again, drugs, so talk about drugs and truanting, okay, and then you can think about also community. What role does the community have, or community work, youth work, this kind of thing. So there are all sorts of things that you can bring into that. You can see when it comes to when he's 19, this is what happens. Okay? So for example, what could have happened before that to prevent somebody ending up in this situation? Okay? And like Claire said, it's quite an open question.
You could write quite a lot on that, but just be careful.
Oh yeah.
You know?
Well, please don't, when you're in an exam, don't just sit down and just start writing like crazy and then carry on, like a stream of consciousness. We don't want 3 or 4 pages where you haven't stopped, we can hardly read it because you've been writing so fast because the ideas are coming. Try to sort of
think first.
Think first is good. Structure it a little bit. Don't write too much. Yeah? So we're more interested in quality than quantity. Okay? You won't get extra marks for extra paper, you know, hundreds of pages. No, we're not interested in that. So please think.
Quality.
And if you can leave time to check very quickly afterwards, even better. Check your writing. Yeah?
Okay, any other questions about the exam? You will be emailed your... Can you just sit down a minute? The next thing about the rooms is you will be emailed. Some of the... You're actually doing the exam in class test in the same seminar groups that you were in. Some of the rooms are the same, but some are different. And if you have an INAR, there is a separate computer room. So we'll be emailing you all those details. But you, please don't arrive late. Okay? The test is only 2 hours long. Any questions?
Turn the lights.
All right, good luck in your exam this afternoon, everyone.